Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Thanks for joining. Today we're talking about influencer mapping, and it's a visual way to show the relationship between influencers in a very specific and defined data set. This first influencer map is from Analytica, and I believe it's from an analysis they did on beauty bloggers a couple years ago. Now it's kind of hard to see, but there are light blue lines in the center, and it loosens up as you get closer to the edges. Without really knowing how they designed this analysis, it looks to me like this data set of beauty bloggers are very, very interconnected. I might even call this shared influence because they overlap quite a bit. Now, this second influencer map is from Tracker. I'm not sure what kind of influencers we're looking at here, but it's very clear that it's similar to the beauty bloggers, right? The gray lines represent relationships, and these people influence each other. Many times it is reciprocal, and they influence each other based on certain topics or discussions. Now, I think it's also important to highlight these nodes in blue. These are influencers who expand the data set because of their connections. They have the ability to reach different types of audiences who aren't necessarily connected to everybody else. I also want to call out this outer layer where there are no connections, right? These influencers are kind of on an island. Now, many times these people are gateways into entirely different networks of people. Because the influencers here in the middle, it's kind of like an echo chamber, right? Of conversations and sharing. And at some point, you are going to stop reaching new audiences. So in many cases, that outer group are more important than those who are in the middle. There are a couple different ways to get value from influencer mapping. Number one, and as I just said, you can see who influences the influencer. Now you might be wondering, well, why is this important? And it really depends upon what you're doing. If you're on the PR side of the business and you're more looking at influencers from a relationship standpoint, well, this is perfect. Influencer A isn't calling you back. He or she's ignoring your email. Well, you can reach out to influencer B in an effort to reach influencer A. Pretty self-explanatory. The caveat being, you know who influencer B is. Now, if you're on the marketing side, you can also get value. But in this case, it's more about discovery and finding new influencers to add to your data set. And from an engagement standpoint, you can expand your list for targeted organic influencer engagement using creative digital assets and targeted paid media. The second way to get value from influencer mapping is a little bit more advanced. Now, most people measure influence using 3 data points: reach, resonance, and relevance. There are others who add an additional data point, which is often referred to as reference, which is if and how often other influencers in your specific data set reference the said influencer. And the thinking goes like this. If you have a group of 10 IT security influencers and all of them but one are connected, you might assume that he or she isn't as influential as the other. And that very well could be the case, or not. I'm going to suggest a different way to validate the true clout of one influencer or a group of influencers. I'd still refer to it as influencer mapping, but it's not mapping against other influencers. It's mapping against a predefined audience. Now, a few years ago, an agency called Rational 360 developed the Influencer Index, which identified the top 50 journalists followed by CEOs. So let's use that audience as an example. 50 journalists that influence CEOs. Now let's assume that you've identified 10 influencers and want to understand if those influencers are actually influencing your top 50 journalists. You'd want to map that group to this audience, and you'd be looking for a few different data points. Number one, affinity. The percent of your top 50 journalists that follow each influencer. And number two, share of mentions. How often, if at all, these journalists mention the said influencers. So if your mapping analysis shows that the audience of journalists do not follow, nor do they engage with these influencers, it's safe to say that you probably have the wrong influencer group. The only complexity with this approach is that you have to start with building your audience first. I've said this before and I'll say it again. You can never go wrong with audience intelligence that would inform pretty much everything you do from there. At that point, you do one of two things. You map your existing influencer list against your audience, very similar to the example I just shared, or skip the mapping exercise altogether and see who influences your audience through an affinity analysis. Now, I hope this makes sense. I know it seems a little complicated, but if this is your first video you've ever watched, I'd suggest going back through the previous videos and start from episode 1. It should all make sense, and each video is only 6 minutes anyway. And that concludes our time together today. I hope you and your family are doing well during these turbulent times. Please stay safe, please stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.